Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whichever time is it where you are. It's a pleasure to be here today and have the opportunity to share with you this piece of work. This paper is being produced by FAO and has been developed by Mireille Totobessola, Susan Caria, Mariola Costa, and myself, Alejandra Safa. Let me start by sharing the rationale behind this document. We are not on track to meet the SDGs, and unsustainable food systems are part of the problem. The number of undernourished people in the world has been on the rise since 2015 and has been aggravated by the pandemic. And we know, for example, that undernourished people can be exceed 840 million people by 2030 if we do not act. We have undernourished people, overweight, obesity, micronutrient deficiency, health-related issues on the rise. And we have food systems contributing to gas emissions, biodiversity loss, or we have also seen that food systems have not been as resilient as needed on crisis and pandemics. We believe that a focus on gender equality in food systems can become a driver of resilient and food security and nutrition in the context of climate change. We know the important role women play in food systems. They are producers, with co-workers, processors, traders, entrepreneurs, and consumers. However, they face substantial and systemic barriers across food systems operations and value chains, from production to consumption. And we've seen also, as I mentioned, the COVID-19 pandemic that has exacerbated the weaknesses of the food systems. And conversely, food systems can worsen the socioeconomic inequalities and access to opportunities. So there is need to advance gender equality and women's empowerment as a condition for transforming food systems to be more productive, inclusive, and environmentally sustainable and resilient, and able to deliver healthy and nutritious diets for all. And gender is one of the levers of change related that are relevant to across all the SDGs that have been identified in the context of the Food System Summit, which requires a systemic approach. The objectives of this technical paper, we have built this on existing knowledge. This is a desk review, and we propose a conceptual framework that explicitly integrates in a systemic manner gender equality and women's empowerment in food systems. This by addressing gender-based constraints and their underlying causes, raising key issues, providing guiding principles and knowledge-based actions, areas, and policy recommendations. And finally, we're proposing some steps for implementing the integrated food system framework for advancing gender equality and women's empowerment. So we bring in together two approaches, gender equality and food systems approaches, to better integrate gender equality dimension more effectively and systematically. We recognize that along food systems, women face a range of constraints as a result of their gender situation. This is due to persisting gender-based discrimination, social roles, gender roles, political discourse, religion, and etc. Men and women do not have equal access to and power of resources, and this results on unequal opportunities for women. We also recognize that prevailing sociocultural norms also limit their ability to exercise power and autonomous decision-making within their households, their communities, enrolled in organizations and institutions, and these therefore fail to represent their needs. We use the gender-based constraint approach in terms of addressing the barriers women face, and we define these gender-based constraints are restriction on men's or women's access to resources or opportunities that they are based on their gender roles or responsibilities. We use two categories of analysis: the access to productive resources and the power and agency. That means that how they access assets, agricultural services, financial services, and then how they manage these resources or have the ability to make autonomous decisions of the use of these resources. And there are several recurring gender-based constraints that will impact the food system's operations. They are not the only constraints, there are more, however, they are the most common. And we have consolidated this in this women's limited access to knowledge, information, and training, unequal participation, leadership, and decision-making, limited access to financial services, inputs and technologies, and women's work burden and time poverty, and the discriminatory social norms. We have reviewed several frameworks, and we've seen that efforts to capture food systems operations have created the different frameworks responding to different objectives and focuses. Their complexity has evolved over time, but we have seen that gender issues have been initially implicitly or partially considered. These are mainly under the drivers of social cultural aspects of food systems and the consumer behavior. This means that they are mainly on where and what to buy and to cook. This is mainly responding to traditional gender roles. So mainstreaming gender and equality and women's empowerment in food systems is new. It's been a recent issue. And we think that this is a must to identify the gender-based constraints across the food systems to be explicitly referring. Let's see. One important framework that has been taken over by several actors is the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition that has proposed this framework in 2017. We have the food supply chains, the main components, the food environments, consumer behavior, diets, and then the nutrition and health outcomes that are the main drivers here. We have, the main outcome of the framework. And then we have the drivers here in the upper part that are the environmental and biophysical, technology, infrastructure, innovation, political and economic driver, sociocultural and demographic drivers. We here in sociocultural, we have explicitly mentioned women's empowerment, and then the base of political program and institutional actions. The emphasis on women's empowerment is to improve nutrition outcomes here, and it highlights interrelation with the food environments and the consumer behavior that are core components of the food systems. To be fair with this framework, we need also to mention that there are overarching recommendations to improve women's rights and empowerment of women, to reinforce access to resources, reduce women's work burden, enhance women's participation and leadership, and create an enabling environment for breastfeeding. Here we see how the outcome of nutrition is very relevant. And in another example is that in food supply chains, they refer to women mainly as producers without ignoring the different nodes and different drivers that are affecting women's participation. So this is to say that there is room for improvement to explicitly refer how gender equality and women's empowerment influence other components of the food systems and vice versa. Then we have another framework that is proposed by IFPRI, and here we have the value chains, the components on value chains, food environment and consumer behavior. It's the same as the previous framework. The drivers also are the same. However, we have here a big difference because we have explicitly, they are referring to gender shocks and vulnerabilities, meaning that in all these drivers, there's a component that has some gender issues. And we have in the outcomes a big difference because they're not referring only to the dietary outcomes, but the gender equality and women's empowerment, economic livelihoods, and environmental outcomes. And we have in the low part, the systemic change that is proposed that needs to be taken into consideration, the informal, formal, individual, and systemic change in terms of women's agency, gender and social norms, access to and control over resources and policies and governance. So we have gender equality and women's empowerment that are explicitly mainstream across the food system framework. We think that it's important to review this schema in a feedback loop, meaning that the outcomes it will impact the drivers and food system components. To get these outcomes, this is to consider women's preferences and women's visions in terms of how this is functioning, and it's not a photo, but a process that is continuously in movement and in change. We are proposing overarching principles recommended for advancing gender equality and women's empowerment. These are the voluntary guidelines on the responsible governance of tenure of land, fisheries, and forest, where a gender element is important. The voluntary code of conduct on food loss and waste reduction, where we consider the underlying causes of food loss, for example, related to gender inequalities. The voluntary guidelines on food system and nutrition, and currently FAO is contributing to the voluntary guidelines on gender equality and women's empowerment on the context of food security and nutrition. We have also key areas for advancing gender equality. Implement gender transformative approaches. These approaches challenge gender norms, promote positions of social and political influence for women in communities and institutions, and address power inequalities between persons of different genders. We also aim at ensuring access to and control over productive assets and address women's work burden and time poverty, promote equal participation and leadership and decision-making, enhance women's involvement in agribusiness and enterprises, and ensure that women are also participating in the production of food, on nutritious food. Several examples that we can share. Dimitra clubs, over 50 FAO and UN joint projects are using this approach, a community-based approach, to enhance women's agency. We also are coordinated gender transformative approaches, UN Rome-based agencies currently being implemented, the gender-sensitive value chain framework and guidelines to guide practitioners, women's involvement in climate change mitigation initiatives, and we have many other areas of work taking advantage of the different entry points in this food system framework. There are several examples of the key areas of advancing gender equality and women's empowerment in the different components of the frameworks of food systems framework, at the value chain level, at the level of food environments, and the consumer behavior. Examples of the value chain level: gender issues value chains analysis is first point, or fostering women's contribution to sustainable and nutrition sensitive production, building resilience, facilitating access to ICTs, membership to organizations and facilitate access to services and markets, etc. At the level of food environments, we have the availability in terms of addressing women's vulnerability to difficult climate conditions, or food assistance, school feeding, food recovery. In the economic access to food, social protection is a good example. And in the consumer behavior, the food and nutrition education that will influence attitudes and practices, and that needs to target all consumers, not only women, but also family members and men and children. Just to go to conclusions, due to time constraints, to the limit time we have, we can say that transforming food systems to contribute to the SDGs cannot be achieved without advancing gender equality and women's empowerment. Food system framework that consider gender equality and women's empowerment partially or implicitly can undervalue its importance, and can lead to inefficient interventions and policies, or even reinforce gender roles and discriminatory practices. We need also to consider the trade-offs that can affect women's gender equality and women's empowerment to be identified and addressed across the food systems. Actions at different levels by all actors are needed to improve sustainability, and women need to be recognized as agents of change. And finally, food systems and gender issues are a complex issue that need us all. We need a role to play there. And in this sense, partnerships, coordinated actions are really important. And finally, the Food Systems Summit that has generated a strategic momentum, resources, and experiences that need to be capitalized beyond the summit. So this is the invitation we're making to advance on gender equality and women's empowerment. Thank you very much for your attention.